Today we're going to go to the third reading of Parshas Beha'alotecha. And here, the Torah returns to the subject of what happened significantly earlier. In Shlishi of Parshas Beha'alotecha, which is the 9th chapter of Bamidbar, the Torah says like this: Vayidaber Hashem el Moshe. Hashem spoke to Moshe, Bamidbar Sinai, in the Sinai desert, Bashana Hashenis, in the second year, L'tzeisa me'eretz Mitzrayim, from the Exodus, second year, beginning of the second year after having left Mitzrayim, B'chedesh Harishon, in the first month, which also means Rosh Chodesh, as the Gemara says, Leimer. So the first thing that Rashi is going to tell us about Perek Tes is that B'chedesh Harishon, the first month, is Chodesh Nisan, of course. And Parsha Shebereish HaSefer Leinemra Ad Ir. We already established previously that the Parsha in the beginning of the book of Bamidbar does not happen until Rosh Chodesh Ir, as it is written, Vayidaber Hashem el Moshe be'echad lachedesh hasheni, on the first of the second month. So since we're talking about the first of the second month, it's obvious that this is the month of Iyar. Thank you. So the question is, we start off the book in the beginning of Bamidbar, it's the second month, it's the month of Iyar, and now we're in the 9th chapter of Bamidbar, the third reading of Parshas Beha'alotecha, which is the third Parsha, and what are we talking about? The Echad Lachedesh Hasheni. We're talking about the first of the second month, which is the first of the first month, which is Rosh Chodesh Nisan. Comes the question, why is the Torah not written chronologically? V'lo molei pasach bezu. If chronologically this happens sooner, so why would the Torah not begin with this one? And the Rashi answers, Mipnei shehi genusan shel Yisrael, because this pasuk, or this narrative, represents something which is less flattering and less complimentary for the Jewish people. Why so? Shakol arbayim shana, all 40 years. Shahoy Yisrael bamidbar, the Jewish people were in the desert. Lehikrivu ela pesach ze bovad. They did not bring a korban pesach, save the celebration of the first anniversary. So after the first anniversary, which is the beginning of the second year, when they brought the korban pesach, another korban pesach was not brought. And because of this, that's Genus and Shel Yisrael. That's the opposite of what we would call a compliment for the Jewish people. So because it's not flattering and it's not complimentary, that is why the Torah specifically emphasizes that this is going to be talked about second, not first, tucked into what we call like the 9th chapter. It's tucked in like somewhere in between a story, rather than something which introduces a narrative. The Ramban tells us something very interesting about this pasuk in this narrative. He says in this book, in the book of Bamidbar, the Torah mentions the mitzvahs which were relevant at the time, as they came to the Jewish people. So first the Torah wanted to complete the narrative of the Midbar, which really started a Chumash Shmos, and then we had the book of Vayikra, the book of Leviticus, which talks about the offerings and the korbanos. So first the Torah wanted to finish off the discussion of Shmos, and then finish off afterward the discussion of Leviticus, of the korbanos, of the offerings in the Beis HaMikdash. Parshas Bamidbar, Chumash Bamidbar, begins with the story of the Degalim, the flags or banners, and the Jewish people who camped around the Mishkan, and specifically the tribe of Levi, who was responsible for taking care of the Mishkan. And the Kohanim were taking care of the korbanot, of the offerings. And then we talk about the inauguration of the Mishkan. And after all that has been put in place, now we start talking about mitzvahs that were relevant or that unfolded at a time when the Jewish people were in the desert. Now, of course, this mitzvah does not unfold in the desert. The mitzvah of Korban Pesach was something that they observed already before they left Mitzrayim. That's true. But as the Tzedel Derech says, that the Jewish people are going to be making the Korban Pesach here in the desert, it doesn't say Vayidaber Hashem el Moshe Leimer. Pasuk Beis begins with the words Vayasu v'nei Yisrael es haPasach. The Jewish people, they made the Korban Pesach. Why? Because there's nothing new about this. The new mitzvah will come shortly. The new mitzvah is Pesach Sheni, a second chances. Now, all we do is talk about the concept of Korban Pesach, which already is an old idea, which has been discussed already previously. And that's how the second pasuk continues. Vayasu v'nei Yisrael es haPasach v'moed. The Jewish people made the Korban Pesach in its moed, in its appointed time. Rashi says, "B'moyadoi," in its appointed time. The Torah wants, even though this is not the original conveyance of the command, and this is something we talked about previously, nonetheless, the Torah wants us to know about this command, and the Torah wants us to know about this mitzvah, namely, Af b'Shabbos, that b'moado means even if Erev Pesach falls on Shabbos, b'moado in its appointed time, Af b'Tumah, even if the Jewish people involved in the Korban Pesach are in a state of ritual impurity. So the idea of Korban Pesach, which we're soon going to learn about, is only applicable if you have Yechidim, if you have individuals who are not able to participate in the Korban Pesach due to lack of ritual purity. But if you have most of the Jewish people in a state of ritual impurity, then in that case, the Korban Pesach is not applicable, and the Jewish people will bring the Pesach b'tumah, in a state of ritual defilement, on Erev Pesach. That's the meaning of b'moado, emphasis in its appointed time. The Sefarno says that the idea that we're being commanded the Korban Pesach, seemingly here again in Parshas Beha'alotecha, even though this is something that already has been discussed earlier in Parshas Bo. So the Sefarno says the following: it's possible to think that since we now inaugurated a Mishkan, that I'm not chayiv, I'm not obligated in a Korban Pesach. Why would inaugurating a Mishkan, why would that eclipse the obligation of bringing a Korban Pesach? Well, let's think about it. In last week's Torah portion, we learned about Chanukas Anasim. We learned about the inauguration of the new Mishkan. When did that happen? Rosh Chodesh Nisan. When is the Korban Pesach have to be brought? On the 14th day of Nisan. That means for the first 12 days they were busy with inaugurating the Mishkan. So we have an example in which the Jewish people consecrated or inaugurated the Beis HaMikdash, and that fell on Yom Kippur, and they didn't fast that year. The celebration or inauguration of the first Beis HaMikdash overrode Yom Kippur. It transcended Yom Kippur, and the Jewish people actually celebrated that day. So therefore, we see that there is this notion that the Mishkan can eclipse other mitzvahs. And if we would have thought, maybe the Mishkan, or the inauguration of the Mishkan, eclipses the responsibility of bringing a Korban Pesach. So the Torah comes along right at this point. We'll finish discussing the Mishkan. It says, "Vayidaber Moshe al bnei Yisrael la'ases haPasach." Hashem came to the Jewish people through Moshe Rabbeinu and says, no. We have to make the Korban Pesach. The Orach Chaim has a totally different approach. The halacha is that a mumar, that a person who has turned his back on Hashem and the Jewish people, is disabled from bringing a Korban Pesach. Certainly the Kohen who served in a house of idolatry, like Beis Chayni, like we learn about, is not able to serve in the Beis HaMikdash. Now the Jewish people all served idols. They made a Egel Azov, a golden calf. And therefore you might think that because they made an Egel Azov, they're tainted by the involvement in the golden calf, and they would not be obligated to make a Korban Pesach. So the Orach Chaim says that's another reason that the Torah emphasizes that the Jewish people will make a Korban Pesach, and they did make a Korban Pesach. As the pasuk goes on to tell us, Barba Asar Yom B'Chodesh Hazeh, on the 14th day of this month, Bein Harbayim, in the afternoon. Arbayim means the 2 points in which the sun begins to set and the shadows begin to grow long in the opposite direction. So that's from the apogee of the sun, from noon. That's the beginning of Arbayim. The conclusion of Arbayim is when the sun disappears on the horizon, is not visible anymore. So somewhere between that afternoon, somewhere between the beginning of the sun's descent and the disappearance of the sun altogether, where it's no longer visible on the horizon. So during that time, ta'asu oisei, it should be made b'moyadei in its appointed time, as we just learned, the emphasis on b'moyadei, kechol chukaisov, uchechol mishpatov, like all of its statutes, like all of its ordinances, ta'asu oisei, the Korban Pesach should be made. Rashi says there's a reason that the Torah uses such a seemingly circuitous expression. It mentions all of the laws of Pesach in redundancy. It says, Kechol chukesav, uchechol mishpatav. All of the statutes, all of the ordinances. Why does it do that? So Rashi says, Kechol chukesav, all of the statutes, elu mitzvahs shebegufay. These are the mitzvahs that are applicable to the body of the Korban Pesach itself. So when it comes to the body of the Korban Pesach itself has to be, there's all kinds of limitations or qualifications. It has to be a aseh tamim. It has to be what we call a perfect lamb. It has to be zachar ben shana. It has to be a male yearling. Ukechol mishpatav. The meaning of all the ordinances, elu mitzvahs sha'al gufay. These are the mitzvahs that have to be done in conjunction with the Korban Pesach. Mimokim achar, but from, so to speak, another place. In other words, this is not a discussion of the Korban Pesach, the actual what happens to the body of the Korban Pesach, but rather, here we're talking about things which have to be done in conjunction with the Korban Pesach. For example, kigoin shivas yomim l'matzah, 7 days where we're eating matzah. Not because it's a mitzvah to eat matzah necessarily, that's another discussion for a different day, but because there's this notion, there's this idea that chametz is toxic, and since you're not allowed to eat chametz, so we talk about eating matzah. L'bir chametz, getting rid of chametz. The chametz has to be rid before you bring the Korban Pesach. Rashi brings in the parentheses, there's another version of this, that the meaning of chukesav and mishpatav is mitzvahs shebegufay, the mitzvah of within the body of the Korban Pesach, seh tamim, a perfect, intact sheep, a zachar ben shana, a male yearling. This is the idea of chukesav. That's the statutes, and mishpatav would be sha'al gufay, the things you have to do to the body of the Korban Pesach. What must you do to the body of the Korban Pesach? Very good. You have to roast it. It's liesh. It has to be roasted. How does it have to be roasted? Rosh al karov, val kirbei. It has to be roasted as one behema, intact, not pieces, not when you divide it up. And this also includes shechutz legufay. Now it also includes, when it says uchechol mishpatav, could also include the ideas which are outside of the Korban Pesach altogether, which are matzah and bir chametz. All right, so we have two versions in how this Rashi unfolds. The bottom line is very similar. Interesting, with regard to a chok, we know from Rashi's commentary earlier in the book of Exodus that a chok is a mitzvah lelo tam. A chok is a mitzvah that does not have a reason that accompanies it. You don't understand it. It's just something you're supposed to do. We don't really know why. In the Difei Maya, it says that the word chok is the concept of a gvul, of a border, of a limitation, of a stricture. And the message is that as wise as we are, and as discerning as we are, as understanding as we are, nonetheless, you should know that there's a chok, there's a limitation. And the limitation is ad po yavo, and this is exactly how far your understanding goes. At this point, you have reached the border. You have reached the end. You have exhausted your ability to grasp and understand an idea. And from here onward, you have to know that rationale, logic, all of these things are no longer applicable. So that's an interesting kind of twist on what is the idea of chok, why chok means the concept of a mitzvah that we don't understand. Vayidaber Moshe b'nei Yisrael, Moshe Rabbeinu spoke to the Jewish people, pasuk daled, la'ases ha'pasach, that they should make the pasach. The word la'asot, you may notice, is spelled without a vav. Usually la'asot is lamed ayin. Sin, there would be a vav in between the sin and the saf. Here, there is a missing. The Beha'alotecha says the reason we only have the letters spelled in a way of chaser, which is called to spell it minus, not to spell it fully, is because this is the only Korban Pesach that the Jewish people brought in the Midbar. Subsequent to this, there was no Korban Pesach brought all the way until they came to the Holy Land of Eretz Yisrael.
What's the reason?
The reason is because the Jewish people in the desert were not able to give a bris milah, or unwilling or unready to give a bris milah. And the reason is because they were constantly traveling. So when a child travels, it's dangerous for a child to have a bris milah. And because of this, we're told that they didn't give a bris milah to their children. They never knew when they would travel. They could travel the drop of a hat at any moment. The tribe of Levi did give a bris milah nonetheless, but the rest of the Jewish people didn't. And kol ora lo yechol bay. A person doesn't have a brit milah cannot eat the Korban Pesach, cannot participate in the Korban Pesach. Now, of course, the plan was not to remain in the desert for 40 years. Right? The plan was to go straight into Eretz Yisrael. Unfortunately, Plan B kicked in, and that was not because of anything positive. It was because of a terrible situation with Jewish people who refused to go into Eretz Yisrael. That's the Chet HaMeraglim, which we'll learn about. At any rate, the reality is that the Jewish people did not bring a Korban Pesach, and because of this, it's called Genusan Shal Yisrael. The Rebbe once asked a question. We say this is Genusan Shal Yisrael, and that's why we started off today's Rashi with the whole discussion of Ein Mukdam and Ma'uchar, that the Torah is not written chronologically. But in fact, the concept of Ein Mukdam and Ma'uchar, or the idea, the notion of the Torah not being written chronologically, and us necessitating an answer, a better reason as to why the Torah mentions Korban Pesach only in the 9th chapter, seems to tuck it into the folds of Parshas Bamidbar instead of talking about the book in chronological order. The Torah doesn't seek to be the opposite of chronological. There is chronology in the Torah. Avraham Avinu was talked about before Yitzchak. Yitzchak comes before Yaakov. The Shvatim come after. You can't say there's no chronology whatsoever. We say the chronology is not an absolute principle. It doesn't always have to be chronological. Yes, the beginning of the book talks about the B'Chedesh Hasheni, which is the month of Iyar, and this is talking about the month of Nisan. It's a month earlier. So why is the Torah not written chronologically? Because it's not necessarily written chronologically. There has to be a reason for it. And therefore Rashi says the reason it's not written chronologically is because it's Genusan Shal Yisrael. So the Rebbe asks, what's the Genus over here? What's inappropriate? What's shameful? What's shameful here? That they brought a Korban Pesach?
No, what's to come?
What's to come? Worry about what's to come after. Now bring a Korban Pesach.
Okay, but
And then I don't know. The Mefarshim, by the way, asked this question, Rashi. So what's the Genus Shal Yisrael? Where do you feel something that coerces you to kind of sneak this in later on, when in fact there's no issue? So the Rebbe suggests that the Genus Shal Yisrael is specific to this parsha, because we're about to learn after the Jewish people are going to make the Korban Pesach, as we read now in Pasuk Hey, Vayaso es Pesach Barishin. They made the Pesach Barishin Ba'aba Asa Yom L'Chedesh. They did it in the first month, in the 14th day, Bein Arbaim in the afternoon. Ba'Midbar Sinai in the Sinai desert. Oh, Lashat Tziva Hashem es Moshe. In accordance with everything God commanded Moshe, Kain, Asu, Bnei Yisrael. This is exactly what the Jewish people did. Wonderful. Mazel Tov. What happened? Comes Pasuk Vav. With this group of people who were in a state of ritual defilement, l'nefesh adam, because they had been in contact with the dead. They couldn't make the Pesach on that day. They came to Moshe. They drew themselves close to Moshe and Aaron on that day. And what did they say? They kvetched.
No.
Yeah, they did.
No.
Sure,
They're doing Shem Shemaim. They want also.
I didn't say it's bad kvetching. It's good kvetching. This was one of the good kvetching that the Jewish people did. What was the good kvetching? They came and they said, "Vayemru anoshim ahema." The people said, "Anachnu tmeim lenefesh adam." We're in a state of ritual defilement of impurity. Hey, lama nigara. Why should we be left behind? Levilti lasais, being disabled from participating and making the Korban Pesach together with the rest of the Jewish people. Levilti, pardon me. Let me do that from memory. Levilti hikriv as Korban Hashem, to being unable from participating in Hashem's Korban, b'moyadei, in its appointed time, b'seir b'nei Yisrael, amidst the other Jewish people. So the narrative goes on. Moshe says, "Imdu ve'eshma, stand right here. Let me see my Yitzav Hashem. Let me see what Hashem will tell me, and then I'll come back and give you a report." Now, what happens? You know the end of the story, right?
Pesach Sheni.
Pesach Sheni. So the Jewish people kvetched and complained. You took umbrage to that, but they were kvetching. And Hashem, how did he respond to the positive kvetching? He said, "Oh, music to my ears. You kvetch for a good reason. You want to bring a Korban Pesach." And what happened? A new mitzvah. A new mitzvah comes. A new mitzvah. This mitzvah was not talked about before. The idea of Pesach Sheni. So the Rebbe says, you know what Genusan Shal Yisrael is? Jewish people, in its entirety, were told they cannot bring a Korban Pesach. And what did they say? Nothing. So you can't bring a carbon pesach. Okay. Where was the yelling and screaming? Where was the kvetching? Here, a small group of people didn't bring a carbon pesach, and they were incensed and horrified and distraught, and they came with this deep emotional meltdown, and they said, "We want to bring a carbon pesach. We want to participate." And when all the Jewish people couldn't bring a carbon pesach, nobody said anything. Now, this has something probably to do with human nature. Even if nobody brings a carbon pesach, okay. But you should bring, and I shouldn't bring, that's already unacceptable. Well, that's Gnus and Yisrael then. Because we correctly understand, you're right. We correctly understand that kvetching was positive kvetching, was good kvetching. It was holy and appropriate. It was good. It was good that they wanted to bring carbon pesach. Well, in that case, how come the Jewish people didn't raise a hue and a cry when they were told that the Korban Pesach would not be brought by them, and this situation went on for 4 decades until they came to the land of Eretz Yisrael?
No, but
That's going to show you.
I thought you were saying that because the whole Kehillah didn't fetch, saying that we have
That's
people
correct.
among us.
That's correct.
But then you went on to say that for the next 40 years, but that you said there was
for the
a
next 40 years,
reason.
there was a legitimate reason. There's a legitimate reason for these people also not to participate in the Korban Pesach. They were Tmeil and Nefesh Adam. Do you know why they were Tmeil and Nefesh Adam? They did an Aveda. They did the mitzvahs.
Right.
So first of all, there's a couple of things that have to be understood over here. Pasuk Dalet says, "Vayidaber Moshe spoke, Ma Tamid Leimer." We know that Moshe spoke. What's the point of here? So Rashi says, "Alek Vanam Vayidaber Moshe Smei De Hashem." Moshe Rabbeinu already was told earlier he spoke to festivals of Hashem. Explains Rashi, Ella Kishashama Parshas Mei De Misini Amar Lehem. When he heard the parsha, they heard the teachings of the festivals. He told it to them. And then V'chazav Yishiram B'Shas Maaseh. When they came to each individual Yom Tov, once again the Jewish people were told about the Yom Tov. Okay, fine. Now going forward to Pasuk Vav, Lifnei Moshe V'Lifnei Aaron. Why did he have to come to Moshe and Aaron? If Moshe didn't know, is Aaron going to know? Where does Aaron know all of his wisdom from? From Moshe.
Oh, it's a Kohen Gadol. It's just out of respect.
Kohen Gadol, very nice.
It's a tag team.
This is not a respect thing. This is a practical thing. You wanted instruction. What should we do? You want instruction, go to the person who knows what to do. This is not about kavod, about honor. This is not about homage. This is about practicality. So Rashi answers the question very simply. He said, Kishashneihem yeshvim bebeis hamidrash. They were both sitting in the area the Jewish people designated as the study hall. They were sitting in the base medrash. Bo v'shalom. They came and asked them. They didn't say, Moses, can you please step outside? Can we have a private conversation with you? Moshe and Rabbeinu was sitting there with Aaron HaKohen, so they came to both of them and they said, "Hey, something's not right here. Anachnu tmeim l'nefesh adam, we're ritually impure, and so on and so forth." V'lo yitachan, Rashi says, it is simply impossible to conceive that it was zeh achar zeh, that they came and they spoke about it, and then after speaking about it with Moshe Rabbeinu, and Moshe Rabbeinu said, "I don't know, I have to ask God." He said, Moshe, what does he know? Let's go to Aaron. That doesn't make any sense. Well, that's what it says. L'Moshe, it says Lifnei Moshe, V'Lifnei Aaron. She'em Moshe.
Lifnei Moshe ve'Aaron. What's the extra lifnei? Does it make a difference?
Well, we'll talk about that in a moment. So Rashi finishes off, She'em Moshe le'hayedeya. If Moshe wouldn't know, so tell me, he says, Aaron, where would he know from?
Well, didn't Aaron know about the mitzvah of the korban, about the
that
within the parameters that Moshe forgot or whatever? Didn't he
Aaron,
clarified it?
That was a logical thing. That was a rationale as to where halacha should apply or shouldn't apply. And we learned about it at the time, the explanation of Moshe Rabbeinu's approach versus Aaron's approach. Right. But here is not a question of a rationale or interpretation. Here is no korban pesach. What do we do? I don't know. Go to Moshe. Moshe Rabbeinu say, I'm not sure. Oh, then we must go to Aaron. Maybe Aaron will know what we should do.
What Aaron related to them more? Moshe would listen to God and tell them what God said to do.
Yeah, there could be an element of Aaron's empathy that they would not have had with Moshe, or maybe that they felt Aaron would try to defend them more. That could be. But nonetheless, this was first and foremost not an emotional expression. This was not about blowing steam off. This was about bottom line. What should we do? Lama nigara. Amar, they said, Ein kodshim. Amar lehem, they said to them, the first time they came and they said, we're not ritually pure. He said, what should I do? Ein kodshim krevim betuma. You cannot bring a korban pesach when we're in a state of ritual impurity, even though that night they would have been pure already. But they were not in a state of ritual impurity that day. Amrulai. So they said, Yizarek Adam Alenu. Let the blood of the korban be dashed upon the mizbeach for us. The koyanim tahirim. V'yayachal habasar l'tahirim. The meat will be eaten. It would consume the korban. That will be tahir already. Why don't you do that? Amr Lahem. He said, listen, I hear your point. Imdu ve'eshma. You have to now stand and let's hear what Hashem says. Rashi comments that this is Ketalmud Hamuftach Lishmaya Mipir Abi. This is a wondrous kind of Mosaic reality. You're not sure what to do? Stand right here. There'll be something to hear. Moshe Rabbeinu was absolutely sure that Hashem would respond. Ashrei Yilud Isha. How fortunate is a human, a terrestrial human being. Shokach Muftach, they can be so certain. Sekol Zman Sha'ayah Reitza. Whenever he would want, the other prophets was not like that. Whenever he'd want, they could only hope and pray and yearn and crave. If they got lucky, so to speak, then Hashem would speak to them. Moshe knew he has a problem. Hashem would speak to him. Now Rashi concludes with some very interesting words, my friends. This parsha was suitable. This parsha should have been delivered along with the rest of the Torah. Ella, shezachu elu. It was these who merited shatei omer al yedehem that the parsha should be said or communicated by virtue of their complaints. Why? Because we have this idea that Hashem arranges that meritorious things happen through those who are meritorious. They were upset, righteously upset, correctly upset. They expressed that chagrin and frustration, and therefore there was zakoyim that made them meritorious. And because they were meritorious, that is why Hashem gave them the merit that the mitzvah should be given through them.
So what's the moral of the story? Should one be screaming?
What's the moral of the story? The moral of the story is to scream Ad Masai. We should ask the Eibush to send Mashiach. Because when you're sincere, when you cry from the bottom of your heart, it made a new mitzvah in the Torah, it'll bring us Mashiach and mitzvah. The Rebbe once talked about that actually.
It seems like, in fact, Hashem had the mitzvah already lined up,
Yeah.
but he wanted them to specifically
that's
ask
correct.
for it.
Clearly,
If they didn't, he probably wouldn't have
clearly
given
the
it.
mitzvah must have been lined up before already, clearly. And yet, the reality was that what brought forth the mitzvah?
Right, exactly.
The kvetching, the
So
frustration.
That's not Gnusan on Shal Yisrael. That's a
No. The Gnusan Shal Yisrael is not that they came and they had the fear of losing out. What do they call it? FOMA? Fear of missing out. This was not just a immature, selfish FOMA.
Precisely.
This was the real deal. This was Jewish people
Precisely.
said, hey, we want a part of Yiddishkeit. We want to be able to experience the fullness, the pageantry, the glory, the magnificence of Yiddishkeit in its fullest sense. Why should we be left behind? The Gemara in Sukkah tells us that the Yossi Aglili maintains that the reason they were ritually impure is because they were carrying the coffin of Yosef HaTzadik. Rabbi Akiva says that was Mishael Ve'el Tzafin, those who carried Nadav and Avihu that day, right? Because that was on the first day of Rosh Chodesh. And therefore they said, Tmeim, Anachnu Tmeim L'Nefesh Adam, that this was the ritual impurity they had engendered. There is an opinion, by the way, that the bones of tzaddikim don't make anybody ritually impure, and that's why we have this concept that maybe Yosef's coffin is not a good enough reason. The Gemara finishes off with the opinion of Rabbi Yitzchak, who says nitmu l'meis mitzvah, that there was a mes mitzvah. And the Ibn Ezra says it is not possible to conceive that you have several million people camped together and there shouldn't be several deaths every single day. That's statistically impossible. Okay, so there was a Chaver Kadisha. So these were the Chaver Kadisha.
Right.
Now there's something very strange about their complaint. When you want to accomplish something, you always put your best foot forward. You don't give the reasons why you should fail, you give the reasons why you should succeed. When they came before Hashem, what did they say? Page Kuf Mem Vav, Siman Chaf. They said, we are ritually impure, which is an explanation or reason that detracts, that does not add, it detracts from the power of their complaint. Why would they point out the deficiencies? Like the dumbest thing a bad speaker can do is start off by saying, I'm really a bad speaker. Why would you tell everybody that? So as bad as you are, now a person will say, they're going to think it's going to be even worse. So a person says, please don't talk so much. I'm really not a good speaker. People say I'm boring. And everybody's thinking, oh my God, this guy really is boring. Like, why would you highlight your weaknesses? They came and said, we're ritually impure. We're no goodniks. But we should get a carbon pesach anyway. Why emphasize that? Number one. Number two, Ketzad Mahava Mitzvahs Pesach Sheni Tshuva L'Tainasim Shal Nashim. The people come along and they say, Lama Nigara, why should we be left behind? And the complaint was further, L'Bilti Hikriv is Karban Hashem B'Mayah, that we shouldn't be allowed to bring the Karban of Hashem in its proper time. And they finish off, the last three words are, B'Seich B'nei Yisrael, as a part of the rest of the Jewish people. And when was Karban Pesach brought? A month later. And who brought the Karban Pesach? The Tmei L'Nefesh Adam, a small group of people. They said, why should we be not included with everybody? Guess what? They were not included with everybody. Even their answer was not to be included with everybody. Their question would have been, we want to participate right now. We want to be with everybody. They didn't get an answer to their question. They said, oh, you want to participate with everybody? Sorry, you can't participate with everybody. You can have your own special thing later on. They don't really get their second. They didn't ask for a second chance. They asked, we want to be there. Let us come tonight. Let us be part of the Karban Pesach with everybody else. The bringing of the Karban Pesach Sheni is separate, not together with the rest of the Jewish people. So the explanation to both of these questions, but this is not a pshat explanation, this is more of a mystical explanation, is al pi pnimis hanyanim, goes like this. The primary distinction between the first Pesach and the second Pesach, Pesach Rishon and Sheni, is that the first one is the time. It's the time. The time. When is it brought? It's brought when it's supposed to be brought. This is what we call lichatchila. It's the right way to begin with. This is al pi seder hamikoidi, by the source, the organic source that the Torah established itself, that on the actual anniversary of Exodus, the Jewish people are going to leave the land of Mitzrayim. Yes, a year, and they have to bring a Karban Pesach. A year later, we celebrate that anniversary. This is the day we're going to bring a Karban Pesach once again. The Karban Pesach Sheni is what we call, in the parlance of halacha and Torah literature, b'di'evad. B'di'evad is an Aramaic conjunction of b'di'avad. If you did it, okay, fine. It's not the way it was supposed to be done, but now that it's done, let's just move on. It's like we can't revisit this. In other words, we have his damnus letikan hama'uvas. We have an opportunity to fix something which was broken. Somebody who did not bring the Karban Pesach in its original time, we have the opportunity to fix it. Okay. Shnei inyanim elu, these two ideas, ba'avodas Hashem, heim avodas hatzadikim, they represent the idea of avodas hatzadikim, the service of the holy, righteous, and pure. And conversely, avodas hatshuva, the avodah of Baal Tshuva. What is the Baal Tshuva? The comeback kid. The one who bounces back after having veered off the path of righteousness. Pesach Rishon is in corollary with avodas hatzadikim. The tzaddik does what he's supposed to do. Lichatchila. Those who go in the right path. They serve Hashem in accordance with the order, as it was set out by the Torah. The Pesach Sheni, second Pesach, Tuam la'avodas hatshuva. This is in parallel to the service of tshuva. Shenoida, tshuva comes along. L'misha sata mehaderech hamikayis, the person who has turned off the path, the person who did not follow the righteous road, made a mistake. Ma'anik alei is dam l'satakenas hamovus. Torah comes along and says, "You made a mistake." And the guy sheepishly says, "Yeah, I made a mistake. Don't worry. You made a mistake, you can fix things. You can still come home." U-turns are allowed. That's the idea of tshuva. Based on this premise. This premise is the notion that the concept of Pesach Rishon, the first Pesach, represents the perfection in avodas Hashem, getting it right the first time. Whereas the Karban Pesach represents the person who didn't get it right the first time, and now ended up on the wrong road and has to get back onto the highway, so he makes a U-turn. This idea is once we have this in place, so we're able to understand details of the Pesach Sheni. Number one, mitzvahs tshuva on the most literal level, mechayeves chilo vidu alachet. You have to acknowledge you did a sin. If a person says, me? I didn't do any sins. I'm perfect. If you don't acknowledge you did a sin, if you can't fess up and you can't own up to your mistake, there's nothing to talk about. The first step towards rehabilitation, the first step to be able to experience your second chance, is to acknowledge you need a second chance. And this is the idea of vidui. You have to actually verbalize it, not to people, but to Hashem. Only after a person performs vidui and he verbalizes before Hashem, so then he asks Hashem bakosha, or he begs Hashem letakin or lahashlam esachosa, that he wants to fix, he wants to rectify and perfect and make up for what's missing. Kach similar, Pesachas mitzvahs Pesach Sheni ba'amira, so too Pesach Sheni begins with like the vidui. What's the first thing they said? First thing is acknowledge, here's our shortcoming, here's our disablement, here's our problem. Anachnu tmeim lenefesh adam. We are ritually defiled. And then they said, after we do tshuva begins with acknowledging wrongdoing. Here's my shortcoming. Then comes the request. Please Hashem, forgive me. So they said, Lama Nigara. But to come along and kvetch, hey, why are we getting left behind? Maybe because you're impure. Don't talk about my impurity. You have your own impurities to deal with. Okay, that's not true. That's not true. A person comes along and says, I'm very good, I'm perfect. But you're not perfect. Let's not talk about my imperfections. Everybody's imperfect. That's not a Baal Tshuva. The Baal Tshuva has to acknowledge, I did the wrong thing. Afterwards, you can come and ask Hashem, please forgive me. So that's exactly the order in which the Pesach Sheni people express themselves. The first thing they acknowledge, it's not a question of weakening their case. That's the meaning of tshuva. That's what enables and allows for a second chance. And then, just like the person doing tshuva begs of Hashem, he says, I want whatever was missing should now be fully made up. So too, those who ritually defiled, they said, why should we lose out on what they had? Why should we lose out the idea of the Korban Pesach in its appointed time? In other words, they wanted Shahakravas Pesach Sheni Tichoshev Lehem, that the bringing of a second Korban Pesach should be considered Ketikon Mushlam, a full rectification, a full makeup, not a condolence, secondary prize. Not like, okay, you can do something too. No. So we want whatever they had. We want to experience the beauty and glory and intensity and majesty of Korban Pesach just like they did. We want Korban Pesach as if it was brought in its right time. And that the soul is immeasurably enriched when you experience and participate in Korban Pesach in its right time. That's what we're looking for. So that's what they asked for. And what does HaKadosh Baruch Hu say? HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, yes, you can do that. Obviously, your second chance, which is going to make up for what you lost out, is not going to be the same exact thing. It can't be the same exact thing. The question is, will the impact, will it engender an effect that's similar to what you missed out on? The Eshleimar, the Rebbe adds an interesting nuance. Sha'akoso, the pasuk comes along later in pasuk Yud Beis, and it says, "Kichol chukas Pesach yaso eisei," like all of the chukah of the Pesach they will do. Reimes lakach. This actually alludes to this. Shabakashasam ochein hiskabla. Their request was indeed accepted. Va'akravas Pesach Sheni, their bringing of the Pesach Sheni, nechesheves l'makrivim mamash, as if they brought the Korban Pesach. Ki'ilu hikrev es Pesach b'moyadei, as if they brought the Pesach in its right time. V'seich b'nei Yisrael. In other words, my friends, second chances are not condolence prizes. The power of the second chance in Judaism is that it can be as if you did it the first time. That's how powerful the second chance is. And this lesson we never saw before. It's never been told, a narrative that has never been fully unfurled until the story of Korban Pesach Sheni. And the message for us is, we do have a second chance. If a person slipped and tripped, and all of us invariably did, we have to own up to our mistakes, and we have to know that HaKadosh Baruch Hu gives us a real second chance, and we can make up as if the mistakes would never have happened to begin with.
And a third and a fourth. And a fifth.
Yeah, and a third and a fourth. The idea of HaKadosh Baruch Hu is very kind. He continues to accept us when we do tshuva wholeheartedly. La'alter l'tshuva, let's all do tshuva. La'alter l'geula, we should merit the redemption through Mashiach, b'mheira, u'yameinu, amen.
The issue I have is
It's working.
impurity wasn't their fault necessarily. It's not that they did something wrong that they had to do tshuva for.
Are waiting for you. Please come back.